Good afternoon, colleagues. It's lovely to see so many of you here today. As I'm sure you're all aware, Equality Challenge Unit works to further and support equality and diversity for staff and students in higher education across all 4 nations of the UK and also with colleges in Scotland. They provide a central resource of advice and guidance for the sector, using very much an evidence-based approach, using research to identify and to change practices that unfairly exclude, marginalise or disadvantage people. Our 2 presenters today are Freya Douglas and David Bass. Freya is the Programme Manager overseeing ECU's programme of work for Scottish institutions and also the team of staff who deliver it. David is the Senior Policy Advisor and a member of ECU's Scotland team. Much of his work has focused on student participation with universities and colleges. And I'd now like to hand over to David, who will start the presentation.
Thanks, Suzanne. Welcome, colleagues, to our webinar on setting new equality outcomes and looking at the practical new guidance from ECU. Looking at today's session, we're going to introduce the new guidance that we've developed. We're going to look at some of the lessons learned from the last set of outcomes from 2013. We're going to go over our suggested process for setting outcomes, and we'll look at some of the questions around alignment and mainstreaming in terms of bringing outcomes together with some of the other policies and equality areas. If we think about where the activities come from, 2013 was the first time that we set equality outcomes. It was a new requirement, and there wasn't really an expectation that we'd get it exactly right the first time. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from the process. Supporting the specific duties implementation and sharing and identifying good practice is part of our SFC-funded program of work. We ran workshops at the last liaison group meetings that we held in June, and the webinar will pick up some of the key points from the workshops, as well as providing a bit of additional opportunity for discussion and questions. So please ask questions as we go through. We've got the chat function, and we'll try and answer them throughout the webinar, but if not, we've got a Q&A at the end as well. So we've got a set of questions that we'll also pick up through the webinar as a series of polls. The first poll question is, have you been involved in setting or delivering equality outcomes before? And if you could answer that now, then we'll have a look at the answers. So it looks like we've got a roughly equal split with people who have and haven't been involved with setting outcomes previously. So I think this will be a useful introduction for those who haven't been involved, but we can also pick up some of the key learning from the last set and hopefully develop some of the ideas for people that have been included in this previously. This is our new guidance that you can see a snapshot of. This is what it looks like, and it's available to download from our website on the Equality Outcomes page. It was sent out prior to the webinar as well, so hopefully you can follow along as we go through. A quick reminder of the duty, particularly given that some of you haven't been involved in this process previously. So under the Scottish specific duties of the Equality Act, institutions, colleges and universities are required to prepare and publish equality outcomes every 4 years. Colleges and universities published the first sets, as we said, in 2013, and we'll be looking at developing a new set of equality outcomes for April 2017. This is on page 3 and 4 of the guidance if you want a bit more detail. We've got our second poll coming up. So the question here is, how comfortable are you with what equality outcomes are? So it looks like most of you are relatively familiar with what equality outcomes are, which is good. That's positive. I've highlighted something from the EHRC that I think is helpful, and it was emphasizing the fact that equality outcomes are results that your institution aims to achieve, that furthers one or more parts of the PSED. And the quote from the EHRC is quite nice, which we've put up there. It says, in practice, you might find it helpful to think of outcomes as results, intended to achieve specific identifiable improvements in people's life chances. So the equality outcomes aren't the issues themselves. They're the result and what it will look like when the issues are addressed. So what will be different? What will have changed for people? For example, we might expect to see improved participation or attainment as a result identified in an equality outcome. Or we could be looking at wanting to see changes in skills, attitudes, or behaviors among students or staff. So I think the idea that the equality outcomes that we're developing in setting are results rather than issues is one of the key bits of learning from the last set of equality outcomes in that process. Equality outcomes are very much intended to help institutions meet the aims of the public sector equality duty. And we've set this out on the screen. Again, it's in the guidance. And the equality outcomes should also then speak across the protected characteristics. Each equality outcome individually doesn't need to look across the protected characteristics, but as a whole, your equality outcomes should cover them. And where they don't, if there's a particular protected characteristic that isn't in your set of equality outcomes, for instance, due to a lack of evidence, then it's important to include a rationale explaining why it isn't there. So getting back to the specifics of the duty and a reminder of the requirements. Again, we're looking at page 3 and 4 of the guidance. We're looking at taking reasonable steps to involve people who share a protected characteristic or groups that represent them in developing equality outcomes. We need to consider relevant evidence in relation to people that share a PC. Published reasons if equality outcomes don't cover every protected characteristic, as I just covered, and publish a report on progress made towards achieving the set of equality outcomes every 2 years. So we'll be looking at a report in 2019 and then again in 2021 on our final set of progress. So we want to begin to think about what we learned from last time, what the challenges and barriers were, and what our experience was. So we've got a question here that should help us frame some of these conversations. And if you could just use the chat function to type and tell us what challenges and barriers you experienced with your last set of equality outcomes. And use the chat and tell us what you learned, and we'll share some of that and share some of what we thought from our review of equality outcomes as well, and from what some of the EHRC findings were.
Okay, so I'll come in at this point. So we've got a couple of people saying that the evidence requirement for equality outcomes was one of the issues that they experienced, and I think that was common across a lot of institutions, making sure you had that sufficient evidence base to enable you to identify what equality outcomes you should be setting. And a lot around also measuring progress, having systems available to do that. I think, again, that's a common issue for lots of institutions. It's really important to set yourselves some indicators of success at the beginning so that you're then in a good place to report on progress 2 years and then 4 years after you set the outcomes. Outcomes being too broad and not realistic, absolutely. So those are two of the things I was going to pick out actually. Lots of institutions have reflected that their outcomes were very strategic and possibly quite long-term, and perhaps not realistic to be able to deliver those in the 4-year period that they had. So outcomes do need to be specific to that 4-year period and realistic for the institution to achieve. Getting good involvement, yeah, absolutely an issue as well. You do need to, for the outcomes, you do need to make sure that you're speaking to your students and your staff and stakeholders, people who have protected characteristics or who represent those people, to ensure that you are selecting the equality and diversity issues that are the priorities to address. And that will make the most difference for those people. We're going to come on to this a bit later, and we'll give you some tips which are also in the guidance. I think that's fantastic. That's been really helpful, everybody. I think the other areas there I'm going to pick up on the next slide, so we shall move on to the next slide. Okay, so we've already covered there the first two, really. The third point there around perhaps having too many outcomes. A number of institutions said back to us that they felt on reflection they had too many outcomes. So, for example, having 10 or more, which did mean that they were not necessarily deliverable. There's no set number of outcomes that you need to have, but it does need to be realistic for the institution to deliver. So have a think about that this time. Do you think that you did have a few too many last time? There was also, the EHRC picked up that some public sector organisations had phrased their outcomes more as outputs. So by that I mean they had outlined the activities or products that they were going to deliver rather than actually what the outcomes, those results would be. So another thing to have a think about there. We also picked up in our review of the reports that institutions published that in some cases the reports didn't clearly outline how all of the different specific duty requirements around the equality outcomes had been met. So, for example, they didn't necessarily always explain all of the evidence that had been used. They didn't always explain the involvement activity that had taken place. So it's a good idea when setting the outcomes to go back and look at those specific requirements again and just make sure that in the report you really clearly cover all of those. What we've done actually in the guidance is we've put together a pro forma, which is at the back of the guidance. It's on page 24 if you want to have a look at that. And this could be quite helpful for you to use when developing the outcomes. It just makes sure you're covering all of the bases really, and you could even use it when publishing the outcomes if you wanted to as well. EHRC also identified that some outcomes weren't that easy to find on institutions' websites. So again, something to think about in terms of where they're positioned on the website. Make sure that anyone coming to the website could quite easily find them. And also think about the title of the report. If you're combining your reports if you're combining your mainstreaming reporting with your equality outcomes, for example, just be really clear what's contained in that report. Make sure the titles are very clear. There are also some quite long reports, which, I mean, it's always a balance here really, because you have to make sure you're covering all of the requirements. But at the same time, you obviously want to engage your staff and students with the report so they are aware of the equality outcomes. So we'll come on to some ideas for how you can get around that a bit later. Another common stumbling block was the dates of Equality and Diversity Committee or board or governing body meetings. As a strategic document, the equality outcomes typically do need to be signed off by the board, and they'll often go through an Equality and Diversity Committee or group beforehand. So thinking about those dates early on and planning backwards can be quite helpful, so that you make sure that the outcomes can be approved before the April publication date. And one of the issues that a couple of you mentioned in the chat box there, getting buy-in has been, a challenge for some institutions into the delivery of the outcomes. It's really important that at this very early stage, whilst you're developing the outcomes, that that they are very much led from the senior level in the institution. That can really help with ensuring that different departments, different parts of the institution are then engaged in the delivery of the outcomes as well, and potentially a model where some outcomes are assigned to different departments can work quite well. We've seen that working in some institutions, and then they take ownership of a particular outcome, for example. We've also had a similar challenge around capacity for delivery, which again comes back to making sure the outcomes are realistic and achievable, but also making sure that they are prioritised by the institution. So again, having this process being led from the senior level is really helpful in that. And then finally there, I think there's been a mixed experience of aligning equality outcomes with other institutional strategies. And we're going to spend a bit of time on this a bit later on, and think about how you can go about that. So we've looked back now at the previous sets of outcomes, so it's now time to look forward to our new outcomes that we are going to be developing. So, as David said, our new guidance presents a 3-stage process that we hope will act as a helpful guide for you when you're setting your outcomes. It's certainly not intended to be prescriptive at all. It's based on our conversations with institutions and finding out how they went about it last time, and then thinking about how we can make sure everyone feels confident that they're meeting all of the requirements. So if you would like to ask you another quick poll. So we're interested to hear what stage you're at with reviewing your previous outcomes and setting the new outcomes. So obviously no right or wrong answer here again, just to get a bit of a feel for where everybody's at with it. Okay, that looks like quite a few of you haven't yet started, which is, fine, still plenty of time to go before April, and we hope that this guidance will prove helpful in getting you going with the process. Okay, so we'll move on to stage 1. So the first step is investigating the equality issues that will inform the outcomes that you set. This enables you to meet the evidence and involvement requirements of the specific duty regulations. It's very important that we say to start with that you're not starting from scratch here. You will look at your previous outcomes as a starting point. So the first stage here is reviewing your progress against your previous outcomes. So key things here are you need to be using evidence to review your progress. So be looking back at some of those evidence sources that you used the first time round when setting your outcomes, and comparing the current position with the baseline position to identify where change has occurred. And you might find that some of your outcomes have been achieved, and that's fantastic, and you'll be able to report on that. And you might find that some have not been fully achieved, and it might then be appropriate for those outcomes to be continued into your new set of outcomes. And that is absolutely fine, so long as those issues that informed the outcomes are still very current for the institution, they are still the priorities for the institution, and so should be continued into the new set of outcomes. So if you want any more information on this part of the process, you can look at page 9 in the guidance. The next part of this stage is actually you're going to be casting your net wider. You do also need to consider additional evidence to understand whether there are any new equality issues or whether the equality issues in your previous outcomes are, still current and continuing. So you'll be needing to cast your net quite widely, as I said, and look at institutional equality data on protected characteristics of your students and your staff. You'll also be wanting to look at things like institutional policies, the results of equality impact assessments and so forth. I'm going to point you to a fuller list of the types of evidence sources in a moment. Then, as well as institutional evidence, you'll also want to look at the national and sectoral picture, because that can help you to benchmark where your institution is in relation to different equality challenges, and that can help you think about whether actually this is, this is a real issue for us because it's like this somewhere else, and so forth. So it's a very helpful exercise. It's important also to consider the priorities of your institution and how equality and diversity issues affect the achievement of your priorities. So again, this comes back to the idea of aligning with strategies, which we'll consider in more detail in a little bit later. And you may identify that you do have some gaps in evidence. There may well be gaps for a particular protected characteristic group, for example, and that in itself might be evidence of a need to design an equality outcome that will fill those gaps. So, we're not expecting you to have, full evidence by any means. So it's helpful to identify those gaps as well. The other part of this stage is involving people. So as we mentioned, that is a requirement whilst you're setting your equality outcomes. You do need to involve staff, students and stakeholders, because that will give you further evidence of what the equality issues are for the institution. So we have given you some more advice on this in the guidance. It's on pages 10 to 11. We've given you a list of tips for involvement activity, and we've also given you some examples of some of the activities you might like to do. So I would refer you to that part of the guidance, as we don't have enough time to go into it in full detail right now. But I would say that involvement needs to be realistic, like the outcomes themselves. It needs to be focused and it needs to be targeted. So you need to make sure you're speaking to people who are going to give you the information that you need. And here is just a quick glimpse of the list of the types of evidence sources that you might want to look at, which is in the guidance on page 13. I just wanted to show you this. We've also in the guidance given you quite a thorough list of links to external reports by sector agencies, Scottish Government, EHRC, to our annual statistical reports that we produce, to SFC reports and so forth. So we hope that will prove a really helpful resource bank for you. So do look at that in the guidance. Okay, so stage 2 is when you're actually going to be identifying the equality outcomes. So you have evidence of what some of the issues are for the institution, and you possibly also have some equality outcomes from last time that you haven't been fully achieved. So now you need to work out which ones need to be in the new set of equality outcomes, which are the priorities for the institution. So This process of prioritising, it's really helpful if it can be led from a senior level in the institution. This will help with the issue around buy-in across the institution if ownership is taken at that senior level. They are a strategic document, you know, they basically are the equality strategy for the institution for the next 4 years, so prioritisation being led at that senior level is appropriate. Do keep the specific duty requirements in mind as you prioritise, so think about whether all of the protected characteristics are covered, as we said. Think about the public sector equality duty and the different parts of that and how that's being delivered through the outcomes. And alignment with institutional strategy is also relevant at this point. I'm going to give you a quick sight of our prioritisation checklist, which we've put in the guidance on the next slide, so hang on for that a moment. So once prioritisation has taken place, you actually need to turn these equality issues into outcomes. So you need to come up with the wording for the outcomes themselves, which is a really key part of the process. Your outcomes do need to describe measurable changes, as we said, so that they are, you know, the results that are going to be achieved rather than the outputs or the activities that you'll deliver. It's important at this point also to think about how you're going to measure the outcome, so we do recommend that you specify a set of success measures or indicators for each outcome, and also at this point to agree timescales and staff responsible. As we said, if you do that at this point, it can help you to ensure that the responsibility for the outcomes is spread out across the institution, and so they should be easier to deliver them if more people are involved, and that is set out right from the beginning. So here is the prioritisation checklist that I mentioned. This is on page 19 of the guidance. Again, we just hope this is a helpful guide for you. So think about scale of the issue. Consider the size of the problem and how many people it affects. Severity, does the issue lead to substantial inequality even though the number affected may be quite low? Concern, do stakeholders, students or staff see it as a serious issue? Impact, is there potential for action by the institution to make a significant impact? As we mentioned, does it further the public sector equality duty, and does it cover all of the protected characteristics, or, you know, one of them if it's a particular issue? Regional context as well is important here, particularly for colleges, I'd say. Identifying issues that are relevant across several partner colleges may be an important consideration in prioritisation if you're going to develop joint activity to deliver them. And then in terms of the formulation, when you're actually drafting the outcomes, in the guidance we have given you a number of things to bear in mind, and this is on page 20. So I'd refer you to that to think about these different areas. And then the final stage in the process is actually getting the outcomes finalised and then getting them out there across the institution, so disseminating them. So it can be helpful once you have a draft set of outcomes to consult with relevant people in the institution to help you to refine and finalise the set of outcomes, again ensuring that you have the right buy-in. As we mentioned, getting senior commitment in place, and also thinking about those systems. As someone said, that, you know, it can be an issue if you don't have the right systems in place for tracking progress and enabling you to report. Think about this quite early this time, so that you can ensure those mechanisms are in place for delivery and reporting. And you will need to seek approval, as we said, and ensure that your timelines match up, so you can do that before the publication date. In terms of publishing the outcomes, you are required to publish both the new set of equality outcomes and your report on progress on your previous outcomes. The way you do that is really up to you. It can be in one report if that makes the most sense for you, or you could do it separately. There's no set way of doing it. Just make sure you're very clearly indicating what is contained in each report. It's really important actually to provide an accompanying rationale for the outcomes that explains how you reached the outcome. So explain the evidence that you looked at, explain the consultation and involvement activity and so forth, because that will demonstrate how you're meeting the requirements, but it will also be really helpful for students and staff to help them understand why you've set particular outcomes. Also making sure the report is easily accessible to staff, students and the public as well. As we said, an area for improvement from last time for some institutions. So just make sure it's really easy for people to find.
We wanted to spend a bit of time talking about strategic alignment, both because there's some important opportunities coming up that link quite well with equality outcomes, but also because it speaks to some of the concerns raised earlier around how you get buy-in across the institution and how you kind of foster engagement with delivering equality outcomes. When developing equality outcomes, it's important to think about other equality-related strategic drivers. They can provide evidence of need, and they allow us to align outcomes with other work that's either planned or already underway in your institution. So taking the frameworks into consideration while developing the equality outcomes means we can align them with outcome agreements, quality improvement activity, and other subsequent activity on both fronts. So we're talking about activity that help us maximize the use of resources, minimize duplication of effort, and will help us achieve impact more quickly and demonstrate mainstreaming of the equality outcomes. So obviously in 2016, Scottish institutions are developing new 3-year outcome agreements with the SFC. So there's an opportunity here to develop and align the equality outcomes and the SFC outcome agreements. Suki raised a question earlier around how we'll work in things like the Gender Action Plan. And I think there's a nice opportunity where if institutions are thinking about Gender Action Plan activity, how that might be included in outcome agreements, it would make sense if equality outcomes are your equality strategy for the next 4 years, then having some form of specific equality outcome that speaks to the Gender Action Plan would make sense, whether that's a specific target for participation in a certain course or something around staff development. I do think that does make sense to include. There's also some other relevant activities. So colleges are looking at developing access and inclusion strategies as part of outcome agreements. And there's also potentially links with community planning partnerships and the development of regional plans and existing quality frameworks as well. So areas where there might be strategic opportunities to embed equality and diversity considerations through the use of equality outcomes and build support across an institution and develop some of that engagement and across different functions that might help you deliver on some of these different outcomes and results that we're aiming to achieve. There's also an important point about aligning equality outcomes with other public sector equality duty activity. So equality outcomes should link to other specific duty activities, and they should inform one another as well. So for instance, staff data and pay gap analysis can and perhaps should be used as a basis and reflected in equality outcomes setting. So other specific duty reports required, and we've put April 2016, but that's obviously April 2017. We've got equality information for employees, we've got equal pay statements and pay gap reporting, and we've also obviously got the mainstreaming report for 2017 as well. And you can publish together or separately as long as it's clearly stated which is which, and they're all easy to find. And the activity very much should be complementary. As we mentioned, it should inform each other, and some of the specific duties reporting is some of your best sources of evidence for identifying key issues and key results that you want to achieve through the equality outcomes. I think it's very much a step that institutions will be taking and that the EHRC will look to see is the basis of new equality outcomes to reflect the experiences of the other specific duties activity that's happened in the last few years. So we have one final question that we're very interested to see what you have to say, and again, if you could use the chat function. But what will you do differently this time to overcome some of the previous challenges that we've identified and that we've heard from the EHRC? And what have we learned from this process, looking at the last set of equality outcomes, and what might we do differently?
Great, some fantastic things coming in here. So Verity is now clearer about how to report on mainstreaming and setting equality outcomes, and separating these and being explicit about which is which is fantastic. I think that's something that a lot of institutions found was challenging last time. We've got some embedding in strategic and operational planning led by senior management. That's fantastic. That will enable you to get that senior level commitment that we spoke about, and to mainstream the delivery of the outcomes across the college. Linking in with other strategic plans, a fantastic idea. We've got to be smart about this. We need to piggyback where we can. Allowing a longer timescale to gather evidence through consultation. Yeah, I think everyone felt, it was all quite rushed last time, and we now know more about how long it takes, so we can get going with it and plan that process and get going now. An equality group that's going to be representing various departments to work on it together. That sounds fantastic. You've already then got buy-in from different departments and ownership of the outcomes that are going to be developed. Yeah, being a bit more realistic about the number of outcomes. Again, common theme, and I think a lot of institutions will think about that this time. Involving more people is coming up a lot, engaging with stakeholders. Yeah, absolutely vital, because these do need to be owned by the institution. And being smarter about embedding equality reporting in other existing reports. I like that idea. You can definitely experiment with that as long as you clearly show where the outcomes can be found. And more around consultation. That seems to be a common theme, doesn't it? And generally being smarter. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good summary there. So I'll just move on to this slide to give you a few final tips and advice that you've already picked up, most of them. but planning your process and starting early. We know how long it can take to involve people in the process, to go through the various approval systems of the institution. Involving the right people, make sure that you're reaching widely and making sure you're reaching people with protected characteristics. Setting indicators of success for each outcome, as we've said, having fewer, more specific and realistic outcomes, being clever in how we align our outcomes with other strategies, tying in and piggybacking, so that we can, so it can be easier for these outcomes to be delivered across the institution. In our reporting, just being really clear that we are showing that we've met all of the requirements. It sounds quite simple, but you'd be amazed how easy it is just to forget to mention, oh, we did this consultation around this outcome and so forth. So just think again about the requirements. Enough time to consult, as we've said, timings of committee and board meetings, and yeah, another common recurring theme around senior management engagement and backing. And then how we're reporting our outcomes so that they're easy to find and engage with. So I hope that that's a good summary of some of the things that we are going to work on this time. So I hope that that has been helpful for you, everyone. I would say please do look through the guidance that we've produced. There's a lot more information on each of the different steps of the process, on strategic alignment and mainstreaming, lots of links to other resources. So I really want it to be a sort of one-stop shop for you to help you as you set your outcomes. So as you know, that's available on our website, and hopefully you've already got that. But do share it with colleagues who might not yet have seen it. We will correct the error on the slide in relation to the date and send them along to you again. And I think we'll also summarise some of the challenges and solutions that you've mentioned in the chat box and send those out for you as well. I also wanted to mention that we are going to be running workshops on equal pay and pay gap reporting. So there's a workshop for colleges on the 5th of October and one for universities on the 6th of October. They're both in Stirling. The college one is at College Development Network and the university one is at the University of Stirling. So you can book on to those now either via the College Development Network website or via ECU's website. That booking link will go live very shortly. And I also wanted to just say, please do use us as a resource as you go through this process of reviewing your previous outcomes and setting your new ones. We do, as part of our SFC funding, we do offer an advice service, and you can very much use that as much as you want during this process. I've given you David's contact details there, so he can be your first point of call, and then we can get other people in the ECU policy team to input their expertise too.